Okay, good morning. Hello, everyone. I'm Vince Stehle, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I want to welcome you all here in the room and anywhere watching us today live or on the recording for this discussion of investing in the future of independent journalism and civic media. We'll hear some brief presentations from our panel and then a little bit of discussion amongst us up at the front of the room, but we'll have plenty of time for some questions from people in the room as well. And I can predict that one of the questions, loosely translated, will be, how can I get money for my organization to do great journalism? That's generally the questions I've been hearing in this room. And I don't know whether we'll have immediately actionable and satisfying answers for that, but I do have an idea. I've looked at the floor plan for the Brufani, and we back up right to the Banca Italia. And so if we come back here at 2 a.m., I think we can break through into the vaults and be out by daybreak.
I'm down.
It's just an idea.
Yeah, the distribution of wealth.
It might be a little more immediately satisfying than waiting for a grant from one of our philanthropies. In any event, I'm really happy to be talking about this topic of investing. It's a little bit different from our typical grants-oriented discussion in philanthropy, but it's not necessarily the natural place to start. Usually we focus on grant discussions, but it's a really important topic. It's been a growing area of interest, so we'll get into that. For those of you who are looking for more immediate grant support, I will say that we do have important information available to you. If you go to our website at mediaimpactfunders.org, I'm happy to say that we provide free access to a grants database, which is a global information. It's mostly information about U.S. Grant makers, but there's also global information in there as well. And you can search for who's funding what, programmatically, geographically, what have you. So I would invite you to look at that data to find who might be a good funder for your work as well. But in the meantime, we're talking now about investment opportunities beyond the grants. And this is an area where really oftentimes when we're talking about philanthropy, the bulk of the information is sort of U.S. focused, but here there's been, I think, leading activity elsewhere in the world, and I think we're going to be starting with Harlan Mandel, who's the head of the Media Development Investment Fund, and he's going to give us a breakdown of their approach to the work. I will say just that as good background for our discussion, there was a great program, a great panel in this room 2 days ago on blended funding, and I would invite you to look at the video of that. As well, this builds on a program that we had last fall with the IPI World Congress at Columbia. Some of you may be aware of that. We had a broader discussion of the topic as well, and so this builds on both of those things. But in the meantime, I want to invite Harlan to kick us off in today's discussion.
Thank you, Vince. Good morning, everybody. It's another ugly day in Perugia. So.
Yep.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Vince asked me if we had any video examples of the work that the companies we finance have done. So there are two recent examples that are very top of mind for me, which we're going to show here. I think they speak for themselves, so don't really need an introduction. I don't know who's in control of the video.
Yo pienso que amar a una persona
All right.
que sí es malo, pero no es tan difícil. Pero amar a otro hombre es algo fuera de lo natural. 11 éramos que andaban en un pelotón de sicariatos que solo nos dedicábamos a matar.
No pueden haber homosexuales en la pandilla, solo vemos varoncitos.
Le van a matar, le decía, no me importa, me voy a morir feliz porque estoy con la persona que quiero, me decía.
Dios hace comparación del homosexual con el perro, como un animal.
Loco. Me gusta verte así, loco.
Thank you very much. So the two companies here, El Faro from El Salvador and Daily Maverick from South Africa, are two of the approximately 150 media companies working in countries where a free press is under threat that we've provided financing to over the past 27 years. So our mission is to advance press freedom and to combat information poverty and to promote transparency and accountability. And we do that by financing independent media companies of various different stripes, both kind of traditional news organizations like El Faro and Daily Maverick. It's hard to call them traditional because they're both incredibly innovative, but then we also finance other kinds of media companies that are not necessarily built around journalism, but that use technology in various ways to advance those values. We're kind of schizophrenic at MDIF, so we think of ourselves as both an investment fund and a human rights organization. There are not many cases where I think those two things go together well, but I think press freedom is one of the areas where it actually makes complete sense. So our point of view is that for an independent media company to be truly strong and truly independent, they need to be financially strong and financially independent. So we use investment tools in order to help companies develop, grow, survive, and hopefully thrive. We do essentially three things. We provide financing through equity investments and loans. We combine that with management capacity building and strategic advice. For most of our years, we focused all of that on the companies that we're providing financing for. In recent years, in order to be able to work with a lot of the early stage startups that are springing up all over the place in the transitional environment that is the media sector today, we've launched a series of programs in different parts of the world which focus on working with a cohort of young media companies and providing them with capacity building, strategic advice, some grant financing, and hopefully getting them, some of them at least, to the point where they can handle an actual investment. Our kind of key ethos is a long-term relationship with every client, and we actually call the companies that we finance clients, and I think that captures the relationship that we're seeking to have. So we work with companies generally, we assume we'll be working with a company for 5 to 10 years once we start. Ideally, we're providing financing to kind of bring them through an arc of development. The kind of, I guess, emblematic of that arc, the companies that we work with, the average company, after 5 years, they've tripled their audience and they've tripled their revenues. And we can't take full credit for that, but we hope we're helping to move the dial a little bit. I know I'm running short on time. All right. The people we work with are amazing, I have to say, as you can tell from these two examples. We have provided, in 27 years, $250 million in loan and equity financing and about $50 million in technical assistance grants. Currently, in 2020, which is the last time we have data for, the approximately 60 companies that we were financing at that point had a combined audience of 262 million people, 99% of them living in countries that did not have a free press. So I think we're going to talk in a lot more detail about how we go about doing that, so I'll pass the mic.
Maybe if I could just ask you to make a point about the Pluralis Fund. That's one thing before we switch over to the U.S. perspective. We heard a little bit about that from Patrice, your colleague, on 2 days ago.
Yes, so how do we raise money? We have a kind of our own corpus of capital that we've developed over the years through grants, and then we have certain kind of investment vehicles that people can lend money to us that we can then lend on to other companies. Over the past decade, we've launched a series of separate kinds of funds. And I think we'll probably be getting into detail about this a little later, how we use those funds to mitigate risks for different investors. The most recent fund we launched is called Pluralis, and this is a fund very specifically designed to combat media capture in Europe. I think, as everyone here probably knows, there's been a tremendous increase with the rise of nationalism, populism in many countries, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. Many important media companies have been captured or are at risk of capture by governments or by other economic actors that have interests that are counter to editorial independence, let's say. So Pluralis is very unique. It's set up as a holding company, which means that it's actually its own separate legal entity. It has its own shareholders. The shareholders are comprised primarily of a few very high-quality Western European media companies, philanthropies, and impact investors. And those impact investors range from everything from high net worth individuals to foundations to even some commercial banks that are coming on board. I don't know if I want to get into the capital structure. It might make more sense later.
I think that's enough to give us a little taste of that very important new development. I think one of the things we heard the other day from Kirsti Stavrom from the Tinius Trust was the important point that a free press is not a poor press, and you need real resources to have true freedom as well. So that's an important message to bring back to the United States too, where we have our own forms of media capture that we're concerned about, and economic and political incursions into press freedom that we used to think of as an issue for others around the world, but is increasingly relevant to us. So for that U.S. perspective, we're going to hear from Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro, who brings, in addition to her current work as a founder and CEO of the National Trust for Local News, brings a background in academic research with important positions at Harvard's Shorenstein Center and Columbia Journalism School as well. So great to hear your perspective.
Thank you, Vince. Very happy to be here and sharing our work in the U.S. context with all of you. So at the National Trust for Local News, our mission is to conserve, transform, and sustain small newspapers that are at risk of going out of business in small communities throughout the U.S. And so to talk about talking about our impact investing strategy, I just want to kind of ground us all in the data so that you all get a sense of how it is we get to an investment thesis and an investment approach. So some of these statistics may be familiar to some of you. So each week in the U.S. right now, there's more than 2 newspapers closing. Some of those are family owners. There's a really strong tradition in the U.S., particularly in small communities, of independent family owners. And these owners are reaching retirement age, and oftentimes their kids don't want the business. They live in communities where it can be hard to find a new publisher. And so many newspapers are closing just because they can't find a way forward in terms of succession. In other places, it's absolutely true that the business has gotten really difficult, and so from a financial perspective, they can't make a go of it. This is an ongoing and expanding problem. We now have 200 counties in the U.S. that don't have a newspaper, and another 1,600 or so that have one remaining newspaper left. And usually these are weekly. Like other small communities around Europe, there's a mix of both daily metro newspapers that serve large metropolitan areas, and then small kind of county seat newspapers that often publish weekly that cover things like town council and school boards and downtown openings. And so that's really the part of the newspaper market that we are targeting. So obviously, and the field overall, as part of this contraction, has experienced a real drop in journalist employment overall. So where we're looking at targeting our investments is in the most critical areas, So that we kind of looked across the U.S. and saw that there are about 1,400 counties that we're calling at risk of becoming permanent news deserts. So these are places where there's one remaining print title in operation, and there's no digital alternative. So there's no either small nonprofit news startup or no blogger serving that community. And these communities also have median household incomes below our national average. So it means that a lot of these places are not necessarily on the upswing, they're on the downswing. So as we think about our investment and philanthropic strategy for conserving these small papers, we're really looking at how can we build a strategy that serves these very at-risk communities. So let me talk about how we get to investing. So clearly the scale of this problem is not going to be something that philanthropy alone can solve. And we are very lucky in the US to have a growing, I would say, movement around the importance of philanthropy in local journalism. But there's just not enough dollars in the system to try to keep all of these tiny newsrooms alive and sustainable. So what we have done, and we're 2 years old, so we're like very early into this experiment. So we are trying to combine impact investing approaches with philanthropy to keep newsrooms in business. So our first acquisition was in Colorado, and I'm just going to advance to our map of the U.S. In Colorado, 24 suburban newspapers, so serving actually a mix of small and growing towns surrounding Denver, that was at risk of being captured by a financial interest. And we assembled a capital stack for this acquisition that was a fully guaranteed loan from a nonprofit lender, fully guaranteed by a set of local and national funders in Colorado. And what that allowed us to do was act very quickly on the opportunity. As you all, I'm sure, are aware, philanthropies move very slowly, and when there's a sale and a purchase opportunity, those timelines don't necessarily match up. So being able to get that capital together quickly was really important for capitalizing on the opportunity. Since then, as we've run these papers, we've been able to refinance that initial acquisition loan, again with a local funder, at very favorable below-market interest rates. And that's really given us some breathing room and some time to figure out, okay, what are the other kinds of investments we need to make in this newsroom in order to reach sustainability. So we've been able to raise some philanthropic funds for things like migrating to a new CMS, for adding reporting capacity. So I think it's a really great example of what you can do with a mix of impact capital and philanthropy around conserving small newsrooms. Our other big project, which is going to launch this summer, we've taken a slightly different approach. So we are assembling a chain of 20 papers, small papers in rural communities in middle and southern Georgia. And in that case, we're using all philanthropy on the acquisition side, and we're doing that for a particular reason, which is we really want to understand what some of the underlying economics are. And I would say that, a sort of limiting factor in using impact investing in general in media in the US is that we get a lot of questions about okay, so what do the cash flows look like? How does this business actually run? A lot of the impact investing that has happened in the US, and I'm sure you can speak to this too, has been in affordable housing and workforce development and has tax credits attached to it. So impact investors are really used to things like buildings and rent and housing, and media doesn't necessarily fit that pattern. So part of what we're trying to do is sort of learn about how we can both run these businesses and then communicate how they work and the impact that they can have so that we can bring more investment capital to the table. So Vince, as we talk about where this is all going to go, I think that's an important discussion.
Super. It's a great start. And I'll just underscore that. There is a lot of support for there's never enough, but there is a lot of support in grant support for media. Just from our own calculations, largely U.S. funding over the decade between 2010 and 2020 grew from about from about 75 million to about 325 million for a total of about 3 billion in that decade. So a substantial amount of grant support. In the same time, there was really an explosion of mission investing in philanthropy. As Elizabeth says, it's largely been in other categories. So to try and get those two trends to align is really important. And one of the few organizations that has done sort of two-pocket funding through grants and investments is the New Media Ventures organization, which is run now by Carlissia Graham. And I think Carlissia brings new meaning to the term activist investor. So Carlissia, tell us about that.
That was sweet. Thank you. Yes, I represent New Media Ventures. We are a nonprofit investment firm using charitable capital to invest where either traditional VCs can't or won't, and where philanthropy doesn't see a need to invest because of their structures. I'm also sort of open to this idea of this bank heist Vince was mentioning, like we need the capital. We started in 2010, recognizing that the power of social media was changing, thereby the media landscape was changing itself. If you all remember in 2010, that's when like social media started to explode. I mean, Twitter at that time had 100 million active users. Facebook had 500 million active users, and we needed a vehicle for progressives to think about how do we actually capture and use these social community spaces to inform and protect democracy, and that's why we came about. For us, journalism is meant to inform the public, engage the electorate, and also to hold public and private institutions accountable. And the only way that we can do that is if we recognize that the business of media is shifting. Like it doesn't look the same as it did 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, and furthermore, it won't look the same 10 years from now. And so how are we thinking about continuously investing as the world changes, and how do we have the vehicles to take advantage of media as we move along? We're in this space now that people choose their news, right? Like and it's often self-validating. It's often in these echo chambers of their friends and family, and it's usually pretty easily accessible, right? They want a low barrier to entry for the things that matter to them, and if we don't adapt our structures for news to meet that, then we're not only going to lose people, we're going to lose democracy. And so we really focus on meeting people where we are in our investments, looking at new media startups itself. Our job is to make sure that journalism and access to good information is embedded in the media of tomorrow, so we're not an afterthought like catching up to platforms. We can think about the wave of media from print to digital to like audio to video to games, right? Like there's an entire continuum of where media is, and we want to be on the cutting edge of that continuum and not sort of like always playing catch up. And so we have to develop new tools for this ecosystem. We have to learn how to use new tech platforms for good. We've got to think about distribution chains and how do we make room for new voices and new spaces. And we also have to build bridges to new audiences. And so those new audiences are finding community and spaces that traditional journalism doesn't. I mentioned audio platforms, but also gaming, right? We don't think about how many folks are actually on gaming platforms. Some of you might be parents who have kids on Roblox, right? Roblox has 22 million active users per day, over 200 active users per month, and 30% of them are voting age. And we have no actual platforms for journalists, for media organizations to start building community on those platforms. Also, social networks, blogs, right? We've invested in blogs about parenting that are growing their subscribers year over year, but they're weaving in pro-democracy messaging, news into cultural messages that resonate with people. And so we like to target our investments in spaces where tech and media intersect, folks who are thinking about new ways to move people to activism, right? And a little bit how we sort of invest. We also have a blended capital structure. So we have We take contributions through foundations, through individual donors, but we also have an angel network that co-invests with us, which magnifies what we're actually able to do on the investment side. And then we take returns from our for-profits to then cycle back into the investment space. We consider ourselves patient investors. We've invested in 125 companies to date over the last 12 years. 40% roughly are about our media. But we don't invest with dedicated sort of endpoint. Like for us, it's impact first. If you exit, you exit. Some of our companies won't ever exit, and that's fine because they're actually like doing good work. And the reason why we invest in for profit so that we can hedge those bets to make sure those companies sort of stay valuable and providing impact long term. And so we like to think of ourselves as mission aligned first, returns second. We take on risk. When I mentioned that like we invest where VCs can't, it's because media is tricky. Right? Like media, you can't have the sort of like short-term return that you can say in 2 years of capital, you're gonna get X amount return back. We wanna be able to give folks a long lead to build new audiences, a long lead to test new things and to pivot. And a lot of our organizations have had to pivot to find their sort of sweet spot, and we take on that risk, and that then allows other investors to come to the table. So the thing about New Media Ventures is that we have an actual angel network that is individual angel networks, but also foundations and VCs who come in and put in after our first check, which magnifies that investment. We have a flexible fund structure. So we fund C3s, C4s, political work. We fund nonprofits, grants, because we believe that a healthy ecosystem has a varied media structure. We need all those sort of types to win. I think for us, we invest in different types of media. So everything from B2B platforms to culture media property to new news properties, distribution networks. We really believe that you need all these types for a healthy ecosystem. And we've been working with Vince and other folks to really get the message out about using nonprofit or philanthropic capital for profit investments. And the reason why we sort of steer toward for-profit media investments is because of scalability. Like news is about reaching as many people as possible, and you need a lot of capital, you need a lot of sustainability to actually reach people. So it's the scalability, it's the sustainability. We want to make sure that organizations can function off their own revenue long term to hedge our bets and protect ourselves from loss, but also so we can continuously fund new media infrastructure as we go about. So we think about media as not just saving journalism, but transforming it. How do we have platforms, and how do we develop platforms, tools, so that journalists have places to go in the future as the world sort of moves? So that's New Media Ventures.
Great. So maybe a question that each of you could reflect on, but how do we make the case to foundations, foundation managers who are comfortable making grants and even beginning or somewhat comfortable in supporting media in the public interest, a variety of ways, journalism, documentary, film, what have you, but are new to the idea of actually tapping their mission investing activities for media? And maybe start with Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Oh, right. I'm sorry.
That's a great question. So I would say the way that we're thinking about making the case is around impact. And I think the value of tapping program and mission-related investments and impact capital is that, in general, on that side of the house, we found there's a much higher bar for tracking and demonstrating impact. So I think it makes our work better as a whole, and it is very compelling to be able to show, these kinds of dollars in. It's not just, to your point about, here's the return profile, but here's actually in very specific and measured and measurable ways how you're gonna get impact. I think we've also had success in helping funders see that both their philanthropic support and their impact capital support can be generative and sort of reinforcing each other. And so, there's a way in which they can get even more kind of impact by being able to bring different flavors of resources to the table. And then I think, in terms of sustainability, as I said, it also, for us and for our funders, kind of raises the bar on what we need to show in terms of sustainability outcomes. So I think in general, it's just a much more precise and rigorous set of tools that's beneficial for the funders and also for us. And so when we can make that case in a powerful way, it's very compelling.
I would say yes to all of that, plus media's infrastructure, and it undergirds everything else. And we spend a lot of philanthropic dollars trying to fix other problems that you can solve or at least mitigate somewhat on the front end by having an engaged public. And so if you want outcomes on health, on education, but you're not putting in public health campaigns or having journalism sponsored in a way that actually engages folks, then you're making up for that money on the back end. In the electoral space, which we also operate, if you think about the money we spend on getting out the vote each year or having to persuade people to lobby for their folks or to get engaged, if you maintain that relationship year over year and you're providing value to them, you don't have to beg constituents to get involved on the back end. So there's also a sort of a trade-off in cost and opportunity cost and financial cost and resources and even relationship management and capital that you're expending if you start to invest in media on the front end.
And Harlan, if I could ask you to reflect on the same question, but maybe as a differential in when you have dialogue with U.S. funders and other funders around the world, if there's a difference in making the case.
So, I think every funder and every investor really looks at this very differently. They have their own very individualized lens of how they look at the importance of this mission and their willingness to accept various levels of risk versus return. And since we're talking about impact investing and investment frame, that risk-return relationship tends to be front and center. In terms of explaining the impact, I think I just echo everything that's already been said about obviously the importance of independent media. And I think in this kind of strange impact investing world, you come across folks who are on the philanthropic side are completely committed to independent media. It's like that's what they're there for. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you can have people who are interested in impact investing and they want to have a diversified impact investment portfolio. So there's health and there's environment and there's education. And the challenge then is convincing them that independent media is also an important slice of the pie that they should be interested in. And we make that case in many different ways. So just obviously, obviously telling stories, referring to the Sustainable Development Goal number 16, which captures the importance of media for good governance, and the way that, and also showing how we're able to make an impact on individual companies, both by collecting a lot of data. I think, as has been said, there's definitely an increased rigor in presenting your data in this part of the fundraising ecosystem. And we also have a track record, so we've returned over $65 million to investors so far, so that helps convince them that it's possible. But I think the major tool is playing around with risk mitigation. And Pluralis is, I think, a very good example of that. So I'll just explain it in very concrete terms. So there's different ways that investors can participate in Pluralis. And there are essentially three levels of investment. There are shareholders, and they are the people who are taking the most risk. Right? So they're putting money in, they recognize, again, this is all about patient capital. We tell them they should expect, that this is at least a 20-year effort, that their money is going to be tied up for 20 years or more. Their return is going to be definitely more likely than not below market. So, our target return for shareholders is, 2% annual dividend, hopefully. and 6 to 8% return over time. And as a shareholder, though, they're much more engaged. So part of the model is to actually have very engaged shareholders, particularly other media companies that are not only interested in providing financial resources, but also a lot of knowledge transfer to the companies that the fund will invest in. Then at another level, we have debt. So we've just launched a bond issuance through a German ethical bank called GLS. And there you have investors who, they want to know they're going to get their money back in 10 years. They have much less risk because the shareholders, don't get paid until the debt holders get paid. And they're, guaranteed a 4% return. And then at the other end, at the very base, we have philanthropy that, understand, and particularly Oak Foundation has provided 4 million euros into the capital structure of this fund. So there's currently about 50 million euros that we've raised for the fund. We have a target of 100 million over time. And I think what's amazing that the Oak Foundation understood was that by contributing a grant into the capital structure, it reduces the risk for the shareholders, it reduces the risk for the debt holders, and with their 4.5 million, they're able to galvanize 10 times that level of capital.
And they're the first loss.
Exactly.
Supporters, great. Okay, well, let's open it up. We've got about 15 minutes. And before I see your hands for your questions, I have a question for the room. How many people are working in organizations that need financial support of any kind from philanthropy in the room? Most everybody, great. And now, just breaking it down, you're really seeking grants, and interested in investments. Okay, so it's kind of an even mix, and some people are raising 2 hands and 3 if they have them.
Whatever you got.
So that's great. Okay, so now wait for the mic to come to you, and we'll start sort of in the back of the room on the aisle. There you go. You're on the aisle.
Yeah.
And if you identify yourself.
Good morning. My name is Boris van Westering. I would like to ask you a question. Many media organizations have a funding mix and are also reliant on institutional donors. Do you see as philanthropy also a role for you to play to do advocacy towards institutional donors, and how your key insights or your funding and your success stories can also be shared to the institutional donors? That's question 1. Question 2 is, do you see for yourself as philanthropist also a role that the way how people absorb your funds, their impact on environment and people, that you stimulate them to help them to reduce the negative impact on people and climate? So is that also something that as a philanthropy you're engaged in?
Who wants to take these questions?
I'll take the first one. We do see that as our role as funders. One, because we were one of the first institutional funders in this space that moved capital toward media, and particularly new media, early media startups. And so part of our job is to take the learnings of every cycle, every year, to then share with our foundation partners, both to move more money, move more capital, but also to understand that this is an underserved market, what can happen with a little bit of dollars, and to get more capital moving even beyond our own portfolio. And so we do a showcase once a year where we not only put together our investments, our co-investments up, but we talk about the media landscape altogether, right? We want more money moving, and I don't care if it's from us or from somewhere else. And so part of our job is to build the field and make sure we're sharing and updating foundations, other institutional providers, capital providers, and VC folks as well, so that they can loosen that purse chain. To the second one, we do hold our portfolio companies to a progressive standard, but it is not necessarily strict on environmental lines.
Okay, and maybe I think probably everyone on the panel can say yes to the first question. If either of you want to add a brief note, but we'll get through some more questions.
So I would just say one of our core principles is that we do not interfere at all with the editorial content of the companies that we finance. So where the question of the environment comes in is very similarly on selection. It's an important value. It's something that we care about, and the reality is most of the companies that we work with are concerned about it because it's probably the most important issue in the world today. I think the way that we advance it beyond just supporting a company in itself is by helping them become more effective in how they communicate to their audiences, both in terms of reach, the number of audience members that they can reach, and how compelling their content can be. So we don't really do journalism training, but we work on with companies on improving their effectiveness, and that carries over to all the issues that they communicate about.
Let's get to another question. Up the two lines up to the woman on the aisle here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Andrea. I work at Documented, which is a New York-based newsroom that caters to the news and information needs of the area's immigrant communities. One category of newsrooms on the rise are newsrooms like ours that serve low-income and marginalized audiences. Newsrooms that could have some form of revenue-generating activities like advertising or technical assistance programs, but from a membership perspective are never going to be truly profitable by the nature of the people they serve and the fact that they have been sort of neglected by the old way of doing things from the jump. What is the path forward for groups like that when it comes to impact investing? Is there a path forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in all of the kind of fundraising and blended capital conversations, we need to be aware that different communities have different needs. The kind of impact investing that we are trying to do is very much geared towards businesses that have been around for a while, that have stable revenues, and we always want to be sure that we're deploying that capital in a way that increases sustainability and impact. And that's a fit for some types of media outlets and some types of communities and not others. So, like in the case of our newsrooms in Georgia, in rural parts of the state where, very underserved small communities. That's why, in part, why we've gone for a philanthropic strategy in some of those places, because, it would be too risky to even have concessionary capital. So it's really important to see these, I think, as tools in a toolbox and not as like a single answer to sustainability.
Okay, let's take another question or two. Let's take two questions. So, gentleman there, and then across the aisle.
Hi, Joe Mitchell from the UK's Public Interest News Foundation, interested in all those sort of blended finance models. Is anyone working with capital that is contingent on impact results? So you've been off the 2% revenue, but I want to see 2% voter turnout increase or anything like that.
Interesting. And let's take another one. The gentleman to your, yes, right there.
Hi, my name is Roman Spanovich from Ukraine, and my question is about risks of investments. So the main question is, for a long time, investing companies in media, as well as donors, were really encouraging so many media, independent media in Ukraine, small outlets, nationwide, that you guys have to start making profits. Building programs, and in fact, many medias, as well as my media, got like 40% of, clear profits from advertising, which actually killed us in the beginning of this war, because we got this 40% gap. And will investment funds will rethink this thing, and how long, that funds can be, wait until the market will come back, will restore, because it may take 3-5 years, maybe more, but at the same time we are under real threat, and we're getting these proposals from oligarch connected organizations who are not directly oligarchs, like we can buy the chair, we can come, and we don't really want it, but at the same time we feel like we are underfunded like almost half. So how long funds like MDAF, let's say, can wait? Thank you.
Okay, let's get some answers. I guess the first one was on additional metrics, impact metrics beyond just the profitability, and the second was how patient can patient capital be?
So I'll just really quickly take the first one. My co-founder was one of the early experimenters in the U.S. with the Pay for Success programs, which was exactly contingent capital, mostly in public-private sector investments. I think the field as a whole is sort of underdeveloped in impact framework and metrics. You know, our goal, and I think the goal of the folks up here, is to get to the point where we can really clearly make those links between, you know, dollars in and movement on important social metrics. So I think it'll be a success when we can do the contingent financing for sure.
I think Ukraine question is for me. So, the short answer is we're incredibly patient. So, you know, in Ukraine, we've suspended all of our loans for now, and have been, you know, focusing our attention on, you know, raising grant support for the companies we work with, and for media beyond the companies we work with, and trying to meet the needs that we can with the tools that we have. So, you know, one of the, you know, certainly trying to provide body armor was one of our first goals. More recently, you know, one of the problems that the printed press in Ukraine faces is that almost all of its newsprint came from Russia previously. So now newsprint is having to be sourced from Western Europe. So we've been working with our partners to have newsprint contributed or, you know, brought in at a, you know, a price that is subsidized 100%. I don't think, I mean, speaking personally, you know, before 2014, the idea that Russia would invade Ukraine was completely, you know, not something that I ever thought possible. So, you know, that's not a risk that we account for, frankly, before we make an investment. But we are patient capital, and we're set up to absorb those kinds of risks, because actually we believe that virtually every company that we work with is going to face something, not that extreme, but some kind of major bump in the road.
Let's see if we can take a couple more questions. Up in the front, gentleman here, and then we'll take another one, the other gentleman.
Yes, hello. Torsten Sewing from fairplanet.org. First of all, this is a fantastic panel, I must say. It is so versatile, so with so many different where do we come from, where do we go? But I have to say this new media venture is something I haven't seen before, I haven't heard before. And my simple question is, would you work with European media as well? Or do you know any, you know, institution like you, I don't know if you call it institution, would work with European media? Because this is a very, from diversity, from all the aspects, it's a very American approach somehow, but it would fall onto very good ears as well.
Thank you. And one more. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Ankur. I'm the founder of Queerbeat, which focuses on writing about LGBTQIA communities in India. My question is just to sort of understand how you're working in markets like India, where I constantly hear from funders that it's too risky to invest in new independent companies. Mine is a new company, and we serve particularly LGBTQIA people because the mainstream media has been historically harming us. So I just want to understand how you're thinking about investing in countries like India, and how can we work together?
So let's hear from Carlissia about the first question and then open it up. I know Carlissia was in Oxford last week and here this week, so maybe she wants to just stay in Europe.
I miss my dog. One, we are a singular sort of entity in the U.S., so our model is very, very unique. And because our backers are really focused on American democracy, we have been limited to the borders of the U.S. However, we are raising for a $50 million fund, which will allow us a little more flexibility. And we've met some folks here who are also interested in figuring out what does that model look like inside the U.K. So we are open to it. I don't know of another partner, a counterpart yet, but we would like to see this model sort of grow.
And if either of you want to speak to the gentleman's question about riskier work with different communities.
So first of all, we are actively engaged in investing in media in India. So please, after this, let's speak briefly, and I can put you in touch with somebody. I think the broader question is about how do we work through an investment model with startup media. And we have a number of different tools for that. It is very risky, obviously. It's incredibly important at this point that people like you who are starting new media companies and experimenting and taking substantial risks, that we're able to join you in that in some way. We have a number of mechanisms for doing that, combination of grants and capacity building and some investing, where we can take that level of risk. So definitely please come talk to me afterwards.
Well, thank you all for coming to our panel. We do feel like this is a growing area, but maybe at a moment of potentially great increase in the coming months and years. You might also want to stick around in this room. The resource discussions will continue with the next panel, How Journalism's Growing Infrastructure Support System is Catalyzing Digital Newsrooms. And thank you for your attention.